Thank you, colleagues, for joining us. I will tell you, we had a little bit of a Zoom drama before this moment, and so we were a little flummoxed. I am Lori Goldkind. I am zooming in today from New York City, at Fordham University's Lincoln Center campus. I am a professor here and the editor of the Journal of Technology and Human Services.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is John Briku. I serve as professor and chair of the Department of Social Work at University of Texas, San Antonio. And like Lori, I am a co-network lead for the Grand Challenge for Harnessing Technology for Social Good. And I'm really glad to be here with Lori. We have very complementary kinds of skills and backgrounds. So I hope that you'll find this very engaging. I think it's a very engaging topic and a timely one for us to be reflecting on today. So could we have the next slide, please? So what we will start off talking about is thinking about the balance between AI and humans in AI-human collaborations, particularly as it has implications for social work research. And later on, I'll talk a little bit about what it might mean to double loop the human component to ensure that the human component actually is the predominant component in AI use in social work research. Next slide, please. So here we are, a nice visual of a robotic hand and a human hand. And I find that particularly a compelling one because my own work has actually had two branches. One branch has been working with robotics that assist people with disabilities in a variety of different types of settings. And the other one has to do with workplace accommodations. And in the context of AI, that would be largely the Internet of Things, for example, apps that would be used in the workplace and other devices that might be used to navigate the workplace. So I'm very interested and tend to view things through the prism to some degree of embodiment in terms of AI, but I also do have some experience dealing with non-embodied entities within AI, which would be like the Internet of Things and could include any number of devices that are networked together that function in order to, in the case of the research I do, assist people with disabilities in a variety of settings. So that's my particular bias. And the reason also the robotic arm is there because, hand rather, is because some years ago when I started working with a computer scientist and an electrical engineer with their project involving a wheelchair-mounted robotic arm for people with physical disabilities, it became clear to me that the robotic arm was deemed something of a person, of having some kind of personhood to some degree, that the social impact of the robotic arm was something we hadn't really anticipated before. And then later, moving over to research involving a humanoid robot, we also found that the social presence of the robot was noted. In other words, the robot was viewed as a presence, much like a human presence might be viewed. So part of my thesis and part of the way I tend to look at the issue of AI and human collaboration is that the robot or the AI in terms of IoT is more than just a tool. Next slide, please. So with respect to that, oftentimes AI is viewed primarily as a tool, and certainly it is a tool that can be used to augment human capabilities. And it is also a tool that can improve human and machine performance with the idea that the human and the machine are able to accomplish more together than they would be able to separately. Over time, there's been more thought given to the idea of how does all this impact humans? So Schiff et al., for example, in 2020, talked about human well-being and how AIs should actually augment human well-being, not simply functioning. Others have also pursued this idea, what if the AI is more than just a tool? So Messery and Crockett in 2024 talked about not robots, I'm sorry, AI as autonomous collaborators. So that casts a different kind of light on the human AI collaboration. All of this is very important, by the way, with respect to social work research, because when we use AI in social work research, in terms of our design of our projects, in terms of the implementation of the project, whether we're talking about big data or we're talking about robotics or we're talking about the Internet of Things, what we see is that it takes on a guise and a kind of performance of its own as an autonomous collaborator, which has a great impact on how we think about the balance between humans and AI and collaborations, and particularly collaborations around research. So AI being more than a tool, Chen et al. In 2022 postulated that we really should be paying attention to the AI impact on humans and then vice versa, the human impact on AI and how they influence one another. So Huang in 2019 postulated that what we should think about is AI and humans as co-learners. And that's something I would like to challenge, and I'll talk about a little bit later, particularly with respect to social work research. Buscella in 2023 said that it's more than simply a tool. AI is an essential precondition to capabilities. So one way you might want to think about this, another area which I've done some research in, is in terms of electronic governance, e-governance, and smart cities. So for someone to tap into smart cities and the resources and the capabilities of a smart city, one has to be able to engage with the AI. If one's not able to do that, one could be cut off from essential services, essential tools, essential resources as a dweller within a smart city. So that's, I think, what Bukala is suggesting. And I'd like to take that even further, as I will in a few moments. Next slide, please. So what are some of the benefits? I'm a big proponent of AI, actually. There are many benefits from the use of AI that I think can benefit social work and social work research specifically. So I'd like to start off with some of those. One of the things is that AI-generated interactions are unique in their versatility and scalability. So we can do things with AI that we cannot do otherwise. An example might be, for example, to create simulations. We could create simulations in our profession and many professions now. There are simulations that are computer generated that can be very helpful in terms of helping researchers think through how to design their studies and then also to generate some hypotheses. There are, however, some costs. So generative AI, AI, like ChatGPT and other modalities, are really lacking in warm-blooded access to this world of shared experiences. So this particular author, Leslie, in 2023, was making the case that since there's no warm-blooded researcher at the core of the research, it may be difficult to garner the same kind of insights or connections or relationships that help us understand scientific discovery, particularly in social science arenas. So there's a cost to it as well. Next slide, please. So let's go back for a moment to this idea of balance, which we're going to wrestle with for a few minutes. So one of the ideas put forth by Huang, which I've mentioned previously, is that what we could aim towards is mutual understanding, mutual benefit, and mutual growth between the human and the AI. I would pose several questions to this, however. The first one is, how realistic is this mutuality? When you think about the computational power of an AI and its ability to make connections which the human mind is not able to make on the one hand, and on the other hand, the built-in assumptions, biases, and limitations in terms of the training set, the training data on which the AI learns, we could see that it may not be entirely realistic for a number of reasons. So I don't think what we're seeking is a totally balanced mutual understanding, mutual benefit, mutual growth. It's a great idea, but I think we need to think about how we can achieve a balance in which the human is centered in the process. Next slide, please. Just this idea. You can see a variety of robots that look very much like iRobot robots. Next slide, please. So, for example, bringing it back to social work, one place that is deemed to be a real-world laboratory for testing AI-driven child welfare tools is Allegheny County. Of course, the county seat is Pittsburgh, that crunch reams of data about local families trying to predict which children are likely to face danger in their homes. And as you can see, it's quite well distributed throughout the United States. And at the same time, what we see is that it actually does err. It makes mistakes. So one example, if you wish to, you could, at whatever you wish, we will have the slides available. You can look at this particular article in which a family makes a passionate case as to why how rather, their daughter was sent erroneously to foster care based on algorithms that were not sensitive to the real context of the child care situation. Next slide, please. So there are certain risks in AI in research, and I'll talk briefly about several of them. One of them is that we would use synthetic data as a substitute for human participants, and we'll say a bit more about this later. But the basic idea is that the machine can create synthetic data. That's part of the versatility of the AI, that it can do so. But then the question becomes, what does it gloss over? What does it overlook? What is it not tapping into? And so, in that same vein, one thing we could find is that in terms of working with hidden populations, quote unquote, which we work with frequently in social work research, it could become a workaround for a hidden population that's too difficult to reach, too costly to reach out to that population. And so there would be a real temptation to use synthetic data as a substitute for human participants. Another risk is that AI literacy might be quite low in the population of participants. And I think that one of the things we would all agree to is that informed consent is very important. But if there's a poor understanding of what this AI is, how it collects data, what it does with the data, I think that is quite problematic. Other things that many people have brought up are around surveillance and monitoring, potential for excessive surveillance and monitoring, and a decrease in self-determination. So there's always a balance there, too, that we need to think about. The black box and lack of transparency. We don't know what data went into the learning model out of which the AI is operating. And then the human-AI power imbalance. And many people have spoken to this in many arenas, which is the cognitive abilities, increasing cognitive abilities of AI computationally, and then some of the structural imbalances too, in terms of how often we're turning to AI and then sort of giving up the human aspect of it. Next slide, please. So other risks that have been pointed out, which are very important, if we're talking about ChatGPT and other generative AI, we know well that they are prone to hallucinations, fewer with each issue of the platform, but nonetheless, hallucinations and errors, so there are epistemic risks. There's certainly ethical concerns about privacy. There are environmental costs, and you can read about this broadly in terms of the computing power, the materials, et cetera, where they are mined, if they are rare minerals, that type of thing. And another thing which authors have pointed out, which I think is important, is there can be an impediment to scientific understanding. Sometimes the data that are presented by AI could give an illusion of depth that's not really there, an illusion of breadth and objectivity, and can lead to a certain amount of credulity on the part of an unwitting or researcher not paying enough attention to the data. Another possibility is monocultures, and this would be very related to issues around algorithmic bias, so that alternative perspectives can be discounted. Now, of course, you can also take another tack and then incorporate those alternatives, but I'm just pointing out it's a risk. And then I think Messeri and Crockett did a very nice job of coming up with this formula, looking at how AI can be an oracle, a surrogate, a quant doing the computational pieces, and an arbiter. And all of those are roles which are we really need to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So one way we can do this to look at some of these risks is to evaluate the impact of changes of the AI's behavior on human collaborators. And the AI can change its behavior based on a variety of things, some of which we need to be cautious about. So one way is, how does the AI generate trust among the people who use it? So the way that people build and maintain trust with automated agents, and I think automated is an unfortunate use of the term automated, because it's really not automated as it becomes more and more flexible in its own abilities to generalize. Anyway, I don't want to get down into the weeds. Impacts collaboration and the overall performance as well, too. So that's one way, this trust with the automated agent. Another thing is the complementarity and human augmentation. Have we aligned the model training and optimization to complement human expertise? Or is it moving along different lines? And I'll give an example of that a little bit later. And then finally, interpretability techniques. So we look at those as ways of improving our understanding, for example, using visuals, using graphics, using many of the other tools that are available beyond simple verbal tools or written tools through generative AI. But the question is, are they actually improving user trust in a way that is not misleading? So we need to be cautious about that as well. Next slide, please. So going back to the AI-created synthetic data, it's created algorithmically by AI. It's machine-generated, and it serves as a substitute or replacement for real-world test data. The risk is around substituting real data for manufactured data, and to prize efficiency over understanding. So the very thing that makes AI so appealing and, in fact, so beneficial is the very thing that can undercut the value of it to us in social work research if we don't pay attention to the cost of efficiency being optimized. Next slide, please. So going back to the AI synthetic data, one thing that can be very much closely related to this idea, talking about efficiency, is what Shimran et al. Refer to as open access data used in an off-label manner. So we all know that off-label prescriptions, for example, are used for very specialized applications for which there are insufficient data to provide a sort of generalized rule. And so it has to, a drug that is going to be prescribed, for example, that's very experimental, needs to go through an IRB as off-label in order for it to be prescribed, because it doesn't have the foundational data to justify that. So this can also happen analogously with open access data. There's lots of open access data, public data, that's widely available that can be used in an off-label manner and published in the use of another task, the task for which it was not initially derived. So for example, if we had data, public data, on a given community and different aspects of that community, and then those data were used, for example, in research, big data research that was built around theories of criminogenesis, where we think about what is the connection between the aspects of foundational aspects of a community and the appearance of crime and criminal behaviors. We could ignore the fact, for example, that perhaps part of what we would be seeing would be due to underlying structural differences moving across a large piece of territory or land, in which, for example, there had existed different types of redlining areas or redlined areas. And so those would all be collected together, and they'd be in a large data pool. The data pool would ignore those kinds of differences, underlying differences that are due to long-time structural differences in different parts of an area. And then that would lead to perhaps overly optimistic results. And by optimistic, it doesn't necessarily mean positive. It just means that whatever the direction is set forth, whether it means, for example, that a given factors in a community, for example, are probably causal factors or possibly likely to be causal factors for more crime, that it may not be justified. So what you need to do is you need to compare the synthetic data that you've used to raw unprocessed data. Next slide, please. Okay, so a very interesting, and I think very vivid way of thinking about what goes on sometimes with misalignment, that is a lack of alignment between AI products and primary stakeholder values, beliefs, and sentiments, is to think of it in terms of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. I don't know how many of you have seen Fantasia, which was a Disney film, I think from the 1960s, but it was a film in which Mickey Mouse, with his magical hat, was able to get a lot of cleaning done, a lot of mopping done. The problem was that it turned out to be far more, next slide, far more extensive than he had anticipated. So he created a monster, essentially, by creating these beings that would swab the decks. Next slide. So this can happen with humans, with AI too, if we're not careful, because the example I'd like to give, and Lori, I'm sure, has encountered this as a journal editor, that researchers can get into a kind of competition for publishing results of publicly accessible data that are overly optimistic. So Shimmerin et al. 2022 warn us that we need to be careful that we don't create these kinds of conditions. And there have been a number of studies that have pointed to the fact that we need to be aware of this, how it can create a competition that really shouldn't exist. Next slide. Next two slides, please. Well, past Mickey. Thank you. So how do we start thinking about human-centric AI? Well, we need to think about, of course, human rights, needs, etc. We need to think about how not only do we think about the algorithms and algorithmic biases, but also how we practice, how we use the AI. And so the example that I previously gave in terms of publications, are we using the AI in such a way that we can win out in a competition in terms of being able to produce more results, but we might want to be a bit more cautious because it may cause some distortions. So as Isaacson says in 2014, we must continue to nurture the imagination and originality of humanity. Next slide, please. So we need to align to a number of human characteristics and human values. So going down to the third bullet, we want to align with human values. We want to assimilate human intents, and we want to augment human abilities. All those three are important. Next slide, please. So value-sensitive training data collections are very important. So you could have curated data collections. You could have human values taught during the training of the AI. You could have human value alignment assessed in training models. So as you create the training models that are going to produce the results ultimately, you will see how the human values are aligned or not aligned to the process that you create. And then runtime mitigation. So as you're actually running the data to see if there are any misaligned behaviors. So use case could be mitigating harm to human creators caused by a generative AI collection. Perhaps the generative AI collection hallucinates about certain things, saying that something has been written or that there has been a line of research where it doesn't exactly exist. And you can imagine how that could cause harm to human creators if that's used as the basis for the foundational basis for a new therapy or treatment. Next slide, please. So how do we make things more centric, human-centric? You can assess stakeholder perspectives. You can reflect on human-centric dialogue. and you can create real dialogue on AI creation and use. And this is where social work researchers and social workers more broadly can get involved in this process. Next slide, please. Interestingly, Kunovsky et al. In 2024 put forth a number of principles which I think are important. Data is or are not truth. Do not presume the desirability of AI, which it often is presumed to be desirable regardless. Respect privacy and the collective good, and be aware of unintended consequences. So I'd like to wrap things up saying what principles and frameworks might guide the use of AI in social work research. Next slide, please. So one thing would be, especially, as someone who works with people with disabilities, my research is around working with people with disabilities, we want to think about co-design and participatory approaches. So social work values, of which social justice and challenging social injustice is really key. So we would want to be cued into transparency. Are the machine learning processes and sources transparent? Is there informed use? That is algorithmic consciousness and AI literacy. Are we attending to biases and trying to eliminate algorithmic biases? Is there authenticity at heart of this? And that would go to ChatGPT. Is there human authorship and connection in what's going on? Competence, have they identified and corrected AI hallucinations and errors? Access to technology for marginalized populations, affordability and usability. So we want to double loop it. So the research is evaluated for impact on participant capabilities and capacities. And we also want to think about participant data safety and closed loop machine learning systems. Next slide, please. So the last slide in my series is about what is an approach that can be helpful to this. So I'm actually quite dedicated to the idea of the capabilities approach being a very helpful approach. There were two main proponents, or actually, you could say founders of the idea of capabilities, one of whom is Martha Nussbaum, and the other of whom is Marta Sen. And I really gravitate towards Marta Sen's perspective, although they're very complementary. The idea is that in a capabilities approach, we're really focused on how does a given treatment process, including, for example, participating in research as well as using the results of the research, how does that impact the opportunities and life choices of those who are impacted? How does it impact human flourishing? Okay, how do you disentangle human progress from technological advancement? That's a key question. And how can we think about having just institutions and just citizens? And so Yoon makes a case, a very good case, that Rawls, whom we often look to in social work for guidance in terms of thinking through a moral-centric perspective, talks a lot about institutions, but not thinking about how the citizens themselves need to be just. And then democratic and just society. So all of those things really come together in the social, cultural, and political, the individual and societal, to think about how do we get a better balance between the human and the AI when we're doing social work research. And that's the end of this portion of it.
Thanks, John. I want to add that folks may be familiar with some of the ideas on the social work side, but there's a lot of thinkers outside of social work who are thinking about how to make AI participatory and participatory data collection and data annotation, but also frameworks that prioritize capabilities and prioritize justice in the socio-technological ecosystem. And so data justice as a model there are a few authors who are writing about a data justice paradigm that sort of extends social justice ideas into the data and technological arena, and also data feminism and design justice that sort of hit on the constellation of ideas that John has just articulated. So we wanted to kind of change tracks a little bit in the arc of kind of research and research production to talk a little bit about large language models in the publication process, and in the sort of concretizing of the research process. And so I am a journal editor. I am the journal editor for the I am the editor for the Journal of Technology and Human Services, and my journal is a Taylor and Francis publication, right? And so we may be familiar with Taylor and Francis and Sage and Routledge, and those, I would say, the predominance of publishers, certainly in the United States, but most publishers of ranked journals participate in COPE guidelines, and COPE is the Committee for Publication Ethics. And among other things, they do a range of different ethical challenges in reviewing and academic publication in that arena. But among the things that they have produced for editors and for reviewers is some guidelines about how to use a large language model such as a ChatGPT or a Bard or a Claude in your academic writing. And so they have come out and said that you cannot put forward a paper that is completely generated with an algorithmic utility as your own, right? And so authors who use AI tools have to acknowledge where in the academic process or in the research process that they have deploy these tools and cite them as appropriate, right? And so it is not within bounds to kind of pass off a piece of writing without attribution in any context for sure, but certainly in this new kind of landscape where language models are very prolific and they can very rapidly kind of produce documentation. We are called upon to, as the researchers, to cite as appropriate where we've used a model in our publication. And so it's kind of possibly not surprising. It's the same it's the same notation structure as we would cite any resource that we would include in our publication. And so this is an example. This comes from the APA of how you would cite inline a language model in a publication. And that I think goes anywhere from putting a note in the body of your author notes about how you deployed a large language model to including it in the methods section if you have used ChatGPT or a language model to run your analysis in Stata or in R, or if you're using kind of more specialized software to do topic models or similar, if you're using the language models in qualitative coding, that we are just attributing where in your manuscript or where in your research workflow you have used the language model to sort of support your research product. And so this is sort of similar in how we would reference a language model in your research. And I think, in the same way that higher ed has been wrestling with where and how to understand if authors are using ChatGPT or a language model in their research production workflow, there's sort of the tools are evolving as quickly as the language models in terms of sort of having one comprehensive way to vet whether a manuscript is original. And so we are really relying on authors to make attribution as we would with any other kind of utility we use, right, in our research process. And so if you're using the language models to code, the same way we would say something about Atlas TI or what's the other one? Deduce in our methods, that we're making attribution to how we're using these tools in our process. Um, and I just wanted to mention briefly, kind of this emerging set of tools and strategies for um, using models on the other side of the reviewing process, or maybe as opposed to kind of thinking about how do we stamp out the use of models in research, meaning like, are we looking for plagiarism in the same way that we're looking for plagiarism in our students' work? As editors, nobody wants to be spending time looking for plagiarism across manuscripts, but there are, I think, some emergent strategies for using language models as an enhancement and as a support in the peer review process. And so after asking a model or anonymizing a paper the same way we would anywhere else in our publication workflow, anonymizing a paper or a part of a paper, and asking the language model to comment in an initial screening, right? The same way we would look at a desk screening. What's the preliminary amount sorry the preliminary evaluation of a paper's quality? Is it relevant to the aims of the journal, right, as stated and agreed upon by the journal's editorial board? And I think that those are places where I'm a very small shop journal. We do not have a robust budget. I do not have a support staff. I am the support staff, and we have a managing editor, and we have two editors at large who are incredibly useful as a brain trust in the publication process at Journal of Technology and Human Services. And so I think particularly for journals that are less resourced, which is I think most of the social work research landscape, that these sort of few certainly bullet one and bullet two, right, assigning reviewers, kind of taking a preliminary pass at a manuscript, are a real boost to an editor's ability to kind of quickly turn papers around, not even towards decision, but certainly in this first idea, is a paper kind of generally speaking of high enough quality to consider sending out, and then kind of commensurately how relevant is it to one's journal? I think that those two ideas, particularly for journals without a managing editor or an administrative support staff, is a real boost to the process of academic publication, particularly when um, we are kind of committed and concerned to making sure that folks get timely reviews, that they expeditiously are able to engage in the review process. I think that those are places where we can offer have real relevance in the academic publishing workflow kind of scenario. And so I encourage, if there's editors here or peer reviewers, I would encourage you to think about ways to deploy a large language model that are ethical and safe and help to increase the way that we are able to give authors feedback. Let's keep going. Sorry, I lost us for a second. And then I just wanted to briefly kind of run through some ideas about, so that we're leaving time for questions, but just briefly through some ideas about where you might consider engaging a large language model in your research process. And some of these have come from an article that was in the Harvard Business Review that I cited in the bottom, and we'll offer those to folks when they do their slides. But we also, John and I are co-leads of the Grand Challenges with Jonathan Singer and Joanna Cresswell Baez, and myself. All of us have written in different quarters about how to deploy a large language model or make use of a large language model in a way to increase research efficiencies. And I think in some ways the models are structured to offer perspectives in ways that are really helpful to us, or can be really helpful to us as researchers, and similarly as reviewers, as we're thinking about sort of in the beginning stage of an idea, how they are kind of designed to consume and synthesize large quantities of data, and particularly for the RAG models, the models that are restricted and built on specific bodies of data, they are able to offer counterpoints on topics that we might not otherwise have thought of. And so, thinking about the example I use in class with my doc students, and I apologize for those of us who are child welfare researchers in our audience this afternoon. But the example that I sometimes use in classes is, what's the new information that we might shed light on for young people who are aging out of care, right? We know that we've known sort of since young people have been in care, particularly for older adolescents, that they have really far significantly more challenges than commensurately non-care involved young persons. And so if you think about sort of how a language model could help in framing your research question or a study topic on young people who have aged out of care, one thing you might consider is to ask the model, show me the five most idiosyncratic or the most innovative or the most contrarian questions that people have discussed in the literature for youth aging out of care. And and again, the models are really optimized and designed to chew through large amounts of data and synthesize kind of big architecture, big data sets, and kind of synthesize and summarize. And that I think is a really nice use of what a model might be able to provide. In similarly, sort of what are the current topics in a particular sub area, right? And so we know with the proliferation of journals has become sort of with the proliferation of journals, not surprisingly, have come a proliferation of articles, and that so with that, it is hard to read all the nuanced and new publications that come out on a given topic. Using a model to synthesize that information, I think, can be a real boost to our research productivity. And then I think that there's lots of ways that the model can summarize different methods, right? So, can you make a table of methods? That have been used in the relevant literature. Those kinds of comparisons, a model can kind of deliver an output on in 30 to 45 seconds, where a decent research assistant might take 6 months to produce the same kind of commensurate amount of and comparative analysis of similar information. And so I guess I would also say, as a person who has received a lot of reviewer feedback, that and now as an editor I tend to look at and think about my own writing in a way with a lens of sort of what is reviewer two going to say about this paper. And I think another place where a large language model can be helpful in your research workflow is offering advice or critique of and considering where the flaws in the logic of your research design and research write up are. And so, kind of trying to preempt and consider how a reviewer um, might evaluate your manuscript before you even submit your manuscript. And so, I think that's a place where having a trusted mentor or certainly having a trusted professional learning community is really wonderful, and people I rely on folks in my field to kind of help critique manuscripts, but the large language models can do that without kind of burdening someone to go through a review before a review, and literally in the space of less than a minute offer kind of feedback about is this paper cohesive? Are my methods in alignment? And so I think that that's a place where, as academics, we can really make use of a language model even pre-submission in the academic research production world. And then, of course, post feedback, once we've received those reviews, a language model can help to synthesize and headline what a reviewer may have said. I think that's particularly helpful in journals where you may or get three or four reviewers of a paper who are offering kind of high quality reviews. One way to kind of summarize and headline those is to ask the language model to offer some perspective on where reviewers are have common themes and what the key points across a set of multiple reviewers are. And I think that is a really nice way post review that a language model can add value and create some expediency in your research workflow. We That's about the end of my talk. And so we were hoping that we could kind of just hear from the audience a little bit about what is exciting about these technologies, what, if anything, is concerning about these technologies. And then this was our original question: how have you already infused LLMs? And I think we've talked about AI and large language models. I think that I we are interested in hearing about both AI and large language models. I think that in our research workflows, we are primarily talking about large language models when we're thinking about infusing AI into the research process. But we welcome sort of challenging that assumption. And so, where are you using these things in your in your workflows. And I'm going to just I don't have to unshare, but I can bring back our toolbar. Um, and it looks like we have some questions in the chat. Let's see if we can make this bigger so we can see it. Kira, if you have suggestions on a better way to do this, that would be wonderful. Um, and so maybe Kara has stepped away. Folks, we have about 10 minutes. We are curious where, if you could put in the chat where, or maybe the chat is, maybe no, the chat's not disabled if Rick was able to put a note in here. So tell us, where are you using these utilities in your workflows, in your research workflows? Maybe we have all stepped away. And so, John, maybe you could tell us, where are you using these utilities in your research workflow?
Well, where I think perhaps there's not been enough attention paid, there is some in the literature, is to think about what does this mean concretely for the types of designs we might create or co-design with research participants, community members, stakeholders, primary stakeholders, the people we serve in social work, um, using AI so that we would indeed have a better balance between the human piece and the AI piece. So rather than have it really uh, requiring the technologists who actually do the coding to the extent that that is done by humans anymore, um, giving them this responsibility, it really, I think, should be our responsibility to think about how do we do that? How do we foster co-designs, given the kinds of research that we do and the importance that we attach to that? And how do we also create more of a balance, perhaps between community and individual levels as well, too? So when we think about when we engage a community, for example, to address a problem, for example, a problem in child welfare, let's say around foster care. How do we engage the community that is intimately affected by this in creating data sets that will speak to the issues that are most important to them so that we start off from that perspective rather than perhaps from the perspective of the social work researcher or the technologists that we work with in a variety of ways. So how do we get down to the nitty gritty with this so that when we talk about transparency, we're not just talking about after the fact, but how do we create designs? How do we think about how do we train ourselves? How do we train our research assistants? And how do we engage the communities that we're engaging with? How do we engage them in the conversation, in the dialogue about making a more human-centric collaboration?
Hi, Julie. Nice to see you. You're using it for class ends for academic work, and for case study examples. I think that and Rick has a just above you, a note about doing analysis of like long long standing policy analysis. I mean, one of the things that the models are designed to do, as I said, is to go and synthesize large bodies of text. And so for those kinds of applications, it's really a boost. And I think that the other pieces I think that are really useful are around literature reviews and kind of addressing key points, and then both key points, but also points that kind of what are the counterfactuals that we might not have thought of. And so I think that those are also places where adding the language models into our workflows can really enhance the research process. Um, we have time for about one more question, one or two more questions. I realize that the tech is a little clunky. I apologize. Other questions about adding a large language model or an AI to your research process?
Well, I'm curious about what people's thoughts are about to build on what Julie said, to develop case study examples. How do we draw in consumers, primary stakeholders in creating those case studies? Because that makes a lot of sense to use case studies as one foundation for how we collect our data and create training sets.
Julie, are you able to unmute? I know we've had this problem before. Let me just see if I can find our participants. Here we are. Let's see. Oh, no, we can't. Let's see if this works.
No, unfortunately not.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and they gave me permission. Sorry, and so what was the question again? I apologize.
So the question was, I think it's great you're talking about developing case study examples. How would we infuse those examples with the perspectives of the primary stakeholders? So, for example, if I were to look at 40 years of independent living, as Rick suggests, which is a great idea, federal policies, how would we get the perspective of the people who were directly affected by that and weave that into what we were able to amass in terms of data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally probably the use I have for it is a little more broader in terms of like application for um, working through the scenarios and giving people different examples. But I think that's really important to ask those questions of how are we ensuring the right literature that's being collected and data that's being collected, are these the right voices and how are those voices protected to begin with and how are they kind of conglomerated to represent a particular type of group? I think are good questions that we have to ask those ethical things. Is this a good representation of the group that we're trying to write a case study about?
And to my mind, that I mean, part of our role as social work researchers is to educate the community. So, working with nonprofits, public agencies, etc., to talk to them about AI literacy, to talk to them about having a consciousness of algorithms, etc., and having knowledge of that, so that as we partner with them on research projects, we can all come to kind of some shared understandings of what is it that we're doing, what's the process, and where are some points where we could encounter some risks that it might go awry. That would be one thought I would have. Lori, what do you think?
I think, I think that we are in the US somewhat behind in how we think about, or maybe we just think differently about how we engage participants and the co-design process. And maybe it's just in social work, but I can tell you that in schools of social work in some of the Western European countries, participants actually weigh in on social work curricula, and so there's often a relationship with the community where there's kind of like a community advisory board that will offer thoughts and feedback on different curricular elements. And I I guess I would say maybe this is a little bit skeptical, but right now co-design and inclusive design and inclusive AI is quite fashionable in the responsible AI universe. And there's folks who are really thinking tactically about how to engage both participants kind of writ large, right? Which in the engineering world looks a lot like people who are not engineers, but who are really trying to figure out how to build an inclusive design process or an inclusive and participatory data annotation process so that there is more transparency across sort of the design and development life cycle of an AI utility. And I think that, I think that the social workers and social work researchers talk a lot about participatory and inclusive practices. But I also know that that work is slows down the research process. And so I think there's always room to improve how we think about, as academics and in university life, how we kind of bring in external partners, and how do we kind of have authentic, right, partnerships that are not just extractive of a community, but also kind of really partner with a community.
Makes sense.
Um, I am gonna I think maybe we're at 1:59 Eastern, and we can end here. And I will, along with John, thank you
Thank you.
for joining us. And I know that we are recording, and so you'll receive recording at the I guess in the next day or so. And I will wish you all a great end to your semesters.
And thank you so much for your participation in this. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.